everyone. My name is Sumaya Hirdman, and I am the Medical Project Manager for Scholarship Track. It's a pleasure to welcome everyone. Today we'll be having a presentation on how to become a successful medical school applicant. And so that's the path many of you are hoping to assume. And so today we'll be doing a fireside Q&A, and we're having a little talk from Janae. Janae is a third-year medical student at the AT Still University, and she is from Arizona. She's originally from Hawaii, but she has lived in the Pacific Northwest. And so please welcome Janae, everyone.
Hi, everyone. It's so great to be here. Thank you so much, Samaya, for the opportunity. So my goal here today is just to provide you guys with some insight into recommendations, not only just to do well with trying to get into medical school, but a lot of this advice is things that I'm even going to be doing as I look into applying to residency. You can go on Google and you can see more than enough advice and things that are just overwhelming. So really my goal today is just solidifying some of the key takeaways about how to stand out and really know if this is the right pathway for you. So a little bit about me. As Samaya said, I'm originally from Hawaii, but I've always called the Pacific Northwest home. So I'm currently near the Seattle area during my third year of medical school. I went to undergraduate at Pacific University in Oregon, where I studied biology and political science. With that, I worked as a resident assistant. I worked as a medical scribe and as an EMT. I ended up getting my remote EMT certification. And with that, after my undergraduate program, I went and I stayed in the Seattle area and I worked in emergency telemedicine. In addition to that, I also ended up running what's called a medical screening department. This was an opportunity that kind of came out of nowhere. I was just working on an ambulance as an EMT, and I happened to come in contact with a talent recruiter, had no idea he was a talent recruiter. And I guess I made a good enough impression that he was like, hey, here's this job. And so I kind of worked from starting this department from the ground up and working my way up. I ended up doing 2 years of gap work, and then I also did some shadowing and I volunteered. One of the places I volunteered was called Harborview Medical Center, where I worked in the emergency department. And so while a lot of the things that I did in my journey to become a physician, such as working as a scribe, being an EMT, a lot of those things are very standard. I was very privileged to get some experience in things that aren't standard. For example, when I worked in the medical screening department. And so that's one of the first things that I want to bring up, is that a lot of times people feel like, well, I have to be a scribe or I have to do this to get into medical school. And contrary to that, oftentimes it's people who don't necessarily follow that path that do something in business. If they do something that they're truly passionate about, that is often what stands out. I can tell you, working with a lot of pre-medical students, that it's really easy to sort of see everyone kind of following the same path and having a hard time standing out. So it is important that you do things like volunteering in the medical field. It's important that you shadow medical providers and making sure that you know what you're getting into. But having said that, you do not have to get a degree in biology. You don't have to work as an EMT or work as a medical scribe. And so one of the big important things that I hope to communicate with you today is figuring out what makes you different. Everyone that wants to go into medicine, whether it's a PA or MD or DO or nurse practitioner, what have you, we all want to be compassionate. We all want to do good care for our patients. But it's sort of the next level about what makes you stand out. So one of the things for me that I utilized in my application process was talking about my degree, not only in biology, but more importantly in the political science realm. I've always been passionate about health policy and advocacy, and that's something that I think really helped me stand out. And it's something that even to this day as a medical student that I still utilize. For example, I worked with the American Medical Student Association as a national co-chair. I recently was a regional secretary for the Student National Medical Association. I'm vice president of my class council, et cetera, et cetera. And so with that, I'm not just doing those things because it looks good on a CV, it's because I'm passionate. And so for you, if you're passionate about like the environment or business, think about how can you utilize those things into healthcare. One of the unfortunate things about medical school is that we really don't get a lot of training into how do you run a private practice? What is a profit margin? And those are things that unless you're purely working in a hospital, those are things that you're likely going to want to get some exposure to. So don't feel like you have to do this straight path and you have to do everything in one linear direction. Really, this is your opportunity to try stand out from everyone else. So taking kind of a step back about knowing if you should even apply to medical school. I had known since I was really little that I wanted to be in the medical field. However, I still explored opportunities about being a PA, being a nurse. I even thought about being a teacher for a long time since I'm passionate about it. And one of the things that I recommend for everyone is don't just shadow one physician, really look about shadowing multiple physicians and ideally for a longer term. Something that will help you stand out is being able to say why medicine, because I can tell you as a third-year medical student, the sacrifices you're going to make in terms of your personal time, relationships with friends and family, it is significant. And it's really important that you have those reasons about why you want to do this path, the financial sacrifices, and even things like if you're in a long-term relationship and the impacts that being in this profession can have for you. And so with that, thinking about mentorship and letters of recommendation, it's really important to try foster really good mentors. And if you're looking for a quality letter of recommendation, I don't recommend just finding a physician and shadowing for 2 weeks. If that's all you can do, I understand, but really what will make you stand out is if you work with a physician for the long term, whether or not that's you shadowing, volunteering, being a scribe, working in some capacity, because what a lot of people want to see in the admissions process is that you didn't just put on, a smile for, 24 hours or for a few days. Most people can kind of fake that enthusiasm. It's, can you do that day in and day out? Are you truly passionate? Are you asking these questions? So when you're thinking about someone who can write you a letter of recommendation, thinking about not just someone necessarily in the medical field, but someone that knows you really well. So for example, with my application, I asked one of the professors at my university that I wrote my senior thesis with, and she was someone that got to know me really well. I also had one of my employers who got to see me work from the ground up to build this department. And even though those two weren't specifically medically related, they could really speak to my attributes as a candidate applying to medical school. So again, thinking about not limiting yourself and thinking about the direction that you have to do. I want to take another moment just to kind of talk a little bit about personal statements and thinking about how do you stand out. So one of the big advice that I got, and I'm so thankful I followed through, is your personal statement. Do not start it off with, well, when I was, 5 years old, I saw someone pass away or I got injured. Now, maybe it's true that the moment that you knew you wanted to do medicine was that experience. And if so, I'm not saying don't ever write about it, but a lot of applications that these people are reviewing, they start off with kind of that sort of generic story. So the advice that I got was to write about a time of resilience and to show through writing how you're compassionate. So for example, I ended up writing in my personal statement about how I was a competitive dancer starting from the age of 3 all the way through high school, and the amount of personal sacrifices that went into that. And for me, I was kind of hesitant because I was like, well, this isn't really directly related to medicine. But by using that story, it showed an example of how I'm resilient and able to pursue something for the long term, because we all know that medicine, it's a long-term gain, not only from your 4 years of undergrad to 4 years of medical school, not including if you take any gap year for research, then depending on the residency, it can be another 3 to 6 years, and you can add on a fellowship, et cetera, et cetera. So the point is utilizing a story or an experience that shows how you are able to overcome adversity in that regard. And again, trying not to limit yourself or thinking that I have to have this story because everyone else has that story. Think about it from like the admissions perspective. If they're going to get hundreds and thousands of applications, what's the story that's going to stand out to them? There was a pre-medical student that I was mentoring, and I read her personal statement, and it was a good statement, but I told her, I was like, I don't feel like I know who you are. I feel like it just sounds like everyone else. And she's like, well, I'm a mom with a kid, but I don't know if I should write about that. And then she mentioned how she was like from Flint, Michigan. And I was like, hold up, you have direct experience with community health and you are a mom and showing all the things you've worked towards. Why don't you bring those things into it? And she was so worried about being judged. And after she did some revisions, her personal statement really stood out, and she thankfully got into medical school. And the point was that it was about her. So all of us have our own stories, and I really hope that what you take away from this is to not limit yourself to what is the right answer, or think about what everyone else says is the right path. Really, what I'm trying to encourage you is to think about what makes you different, what makes you stand out. When you want to describe being compassionate, I don't recommend saying I'm a compassionate person. Show a story, tell a story about how you're compassionate, how you demonstrate those things. Another thing that I wanted to talk about is the Mcat. So when I took the Mcat and started studying, it was after I graduated from my undergraduate program. And one of the things I wish I would have known is one of the question bank resources called UWorld. I'm not affiliated with UWorld. I'm just a medical student that uses it, and I wish I would have known about it for the Mcat. Basically, when you want to study for the Mcat, one of the best things you can do is do active learning. This applies to medical school as well, and so doing practice questions is a really wonderful thing. And UWorld actually has questions for pre-medical students when they're studying for their Mcat. I never used that. I wish I would have. I think it would have improved my score, but I used it for studying for my medical school boards. And I am so thankful that I used it because I think it really helped me get the scores that I wanted. And so I'm throwing that out there again, just not only because I really recommend this product based on my own personal experience, but to encourage you to think about when you're studying for things like the Mcat or you're studying for your boards when you are in medical school, to think about opportunities for active learning. In addition to question banks, utilizing things like a tutor or a mentor is really helpful. I wish when I was taking my 2 gap years that I would have partnered with someone who was in medical school to help me maybe learn topics and also kind of know the ins and outs of what is going on. When I joined medical school, I ended up doing very well in my classes that I became a tutor for other medical students. And being a tutor is one of the most amazing opportunities, not only if you love to teach, but even more importantly, it engages you in active learning. I can't tell you how many moments I felt like I didn't understand a topic, and then a peer or someone would ask me about it. And then all of a sudden it was like, okay, I can explain it so I understand it. So in your capacity, especially with COVID, there are opportunities for you to tutor online that will not only look really good on your CV, but it gives you even more experience in something that you will likely want to do in medical school. As an undergrad or during your gap year, it's just really important that you diversify yourself as much as possible. Again, don't feel like you need to do this straightforward path like everyone else. Another thing I wanted to talk about in those regards is about mentorship. So when I was a pre-med, I didn't know about the American Medical Student Association or the Student National Medical Association and some of their resources. So I want to highlight those here. I will say I did like national and regional work with both of these organizations, and so I can attest to how amazing they are. And I just want to speak to them a little bit because they do have really great opportunities for you to get remote leadership experience for your application, but even more importantly, help you network with current medical students and faculty. So the American Medical Student Association, also known as AMSA, they actually have courses that I wish I would have known about as a pre-med about things like LGBTQ health, about public health, global health, etc. And so I highly recommend considering reaching out to them and looking on their website. Another resource that is amazing is called the Student National Medical Association. If you are an underrepresented minority in particular, I highly recommend utilizing the Student National Medical Association. Their big goal is trying to increase the amount of underrepresented minorities in medicine, and especially during the time where we see all the discrimination that is coming to light within like the African American community, etc. It's so important that whether or not you are like me and you want to be an ally, or whether or not you're part of that community, that we become as educated as possible and also provide resources. So I highly recommend going to the SNMA website. And then something I also wanted to just share is that within my school, the A.T. Still University, we worked with our Office of Diversity and Inclusion to create a mentorship program that you all are welcome to sign up for. The link I have in the chat, I don't know if Samaya, if you might be able to like put that in the description at the end, but basically any of you that want to be paired up with a current medical student and get some mentorship, please sign up. We're happy to help. It's such an intimidating process with medical school. Not only the process of getting in, but then once you're in, it's really hard to feel like you have any time for yourself. And I can't emphasize enough how important it is to build up those relationships, to have someone helping you guide through the process, ideally multiple people. So there's a lot of other wonderful organizations out there. I only highlighted AMSA and SNMA just because I have personal experience with them, so I can attest to them. But please, again, don't limit yourself. There are so many wonderful resources that can help you. I wanted to also make sure I highlighted a little bit about interviewing, because once you get through the personal statement and you finally get to the point of interviews, there's a lot of different ways that they're structured. And so one of the ways that you'll likely hear about is called the multiple mini interview. What this basically entails is that you go up to like a room and they'll have like a card. Now, because of COVID, you likely won't be in person, so I'm not too sure the logistics of how this could work, but essentially the premise is you don't get to prepare with the prompt. You come up to the door, you come up to the screen, and then you have like 30 seconds to read the prompt, and then you have a few minutes to basically like answer the question or describe what's going on. And this is really just testing your ability to think quick on your feet, etc. Then they also have like standard interview formats where it's like one-on-one with an admissions counselor. And so really with that, what I recommend is before your interview, see if you can reach out to a current medical student, reach out to admission staff. You want to be as prepared as you can for your interview. In addition, something that can be really hard with interviewing, especially when it's remote because of COVID, is how do you convey professionalism and calmness and just being your genuine self through camera. And so with this, it's really helpful if you can practice ideally multiple times with different people to get feedback. And with that, trying to think about being your natural self, especially so if you're on camera, like even right now, if I was kind of standing here like this, I'd probably seem a lot more, nervous. And so it's just really important to think about your demeanor, thinking about how you're carrying yourself. And oftentimes we don't even realize it. It's important too with your inflection of your voice and allowing yourself time to answer a question. So for example, let's say you're in the thick of an middle of an interview and they ask you a question, your brain kind of goes blank. It's okay. And in fact, sometimes even encouraged to say, I just want to make sure I understood the question. Is this what you meant? And so that really shows that you're engaged with it and you're not just spurting out the first answer. One of the best advice that I got, and I'm sure certainly me practicing this for my residency interviews, is making sure that you don't prepare all your statements. So what I mean by that is if you're expecting the question, what is your biggest weakness? Don't come up with your answer and have it memorized word for word, because likely that will set you up for all of a sudden blanking when you hear the question. And so what I really encourage you to do is think about general themes with the question. So for example, if you want to think about your biggest weakness, have a general idea of what your biggest weakness is or a story that answers that, but don't think about it in all detail. That way, when you're talking, it's much more organic and natural. And that's one of the most important things is when you're in your interview, this is your opportunity to show who you are, to convey that you're comfortable with public speaking. And if you feel like that's not one of your biggest strengths, that's okay. This is one of the best opportunities as a pre-med to start getting that opportunity to start practicing, engaging in leadership opportunities. So I know I've thrown out a lot of advice, and I'm sorry if I talked really fast. I'm really excited for all this, but I just kind of, before any questions, I just want to take a quick step back and do kind of a big picture of the themes. So big thing is don't feel like you have to do this one path. In fact, if you do something that's slightly off course, that might actually be a benefit to helping you stand out. I forgot to mention this, but I personally, my bias is I think it's wonderful to take gap years. It seems to me that a lot of the medical schools are preferring students that have experience. I don't have data to support this. I'm speaking as seeing the demographics within my school and other medical schools, that not a lot of students are coming straight from undergrad. And I think there's a lot of benefit to that. One, it gives you the opportunity to explore and see, is this really what you want to do? Because once you start medical school, it is so hard to find the time for any other passions. And so if you take the time before you apply to medical school to really reflect on what you want and is this really the right path for you, it can help you stand out and help you be more sure once you are in medical school that it's all worth it, all the hard work that you're doing. And so it's okay if you take a gap year. Many of my classmates, they started medical school in their late 20s, some of them even in their 30s. That's not, don't see that as a disadvantage. Really just follow through what feels best for you, whether it's seeing how things go with COVID, whether it's finances. Just don't feel like you have to do this because that's what they said on Student Doctor Network or that's what they said on this website. Really think about like what's genuine to you and your desires and needs. And please, please, please do not go into medicine unless you know for sure this is what you want to do. It is going to challenge you in every capacity, emotionally, mentally, and even physically, trying to make sure that you find time even to exercise. I can't tell you how many of my classmates and we sometimes feel guilty for like going for a run because we're like, we should always be studying. And we should always be studying, that's what we're told, but it's really about how do you take care of yourself and make sure that you're doing this because you're truly passionate about it. The long hours are worth it. I just got off a 7-day shift for inpatient rotation, which is basically we were in the hospital and I was doing 13-hour days, 7 days, and then I was coming home and studying. And I'm not saying that to intimidate you. I'm saying that as context to really think about, is this the right choice for you? And to know your reasons why this is worth it. So again, don't limit yourself and your opportunities. Utilize your networking resources, utilize mentors, reach out to people to shadow. You're not going to have the opportunity to shadow unless you take that step and reach out. You might not hear back from physicians. Sometimes you just got to be persistent. Utilize resources like the American Medical Student Association, Student National Medical Association. Just think outside the box, utilize Google and try follow as many passions as you can before you start med school, because once you start med school, it's really hard to find time for much else besides studying. But I know I've said a lot. I'm happy to answer questions, and hopefully this eases a little bit of worries from some of the people.
Thank you very much, Janae. I feel like many students assume that when they need to get experience in shadowing, volunteering, or just extracurriculars, they have to do something related to medicine. And so I have some questions about majors that students can major in. So knowing that the classes don't have to do, as long as you complete the requirements, you can have any major you want. Is there any majors that you suggest students to take so they can have a better advantage as going to knowing the courses that are going to be taken later on in medical school?
Definitely the sciences is going to be really helpful, particularly if you take things, a lot of schools actually require you take like a biochemistry and organic chemistry course just to get in. But I think having like my biology degree was very helpful, and especially taking biochemistry. In fact, I know a lot of schools when I was applying that you could do like 2 semesters of organic chemistry or like 1 semester of OChem and 1 semester biochem. I highly recommend taking biochem, even if you have to take 2 semesters of OChem, because a lot of medical schools, especially when you integrate the pharmacology and the immunology, it involves biochemistry. So I think that's something I wish I would have known. Also, if you have the opportunity to take anatomy and physiology, highly recommend doing that, especially in your first year of medical school. Most schools, you're going to be working with like cadavers. And so for me, it was really helpful to have sort of a baseline of anatomy and physiology before jumping in. But like I said, I got also my degree in political science, and I think that was a huge asset. So if you get your degree in public health or sociology or business, that's wonderful. Just I highly recommend also maybe getting a minor in a science degree if you're not doing that purely as your major, just because it will make it a lot easier to refresh yourself on the concepts. And also when you're studying for the Mcat, it won't feel as new.
Thank you very much. And so another question is that, so currently due to the COVID, a lot of students have lost their internship opportunities and maybe even volunteering. Do you have any suggestions on what they can do in their free time so they can have some experience?
Absolutely. So just going online, there are quite a few opportunities to do like online tutoring and those are things that I highly recommend. Personally, that's what I'm doing for a lot of my current volunteer hours is I'm just doing online tutoring. And so that's a really great thing to do. There's also things potentially that you could do with like telehealth services. And again, don't limit yourself to being like, it has to be a medical volunteering. One of the activities that I did was I think it was called Letters to the Heart or something, where we literally just wrote letters to people in the hospitals and geriatric patients. So again, try not to limit yourself and knowing that there are a lot of things that you can do with that. I see the question, what did you major in? So I majored in biology and also studied political science.
Thank you very much. And so for the MCAT, how long, is there like a specific amount of times that students need to prepare prior to MCAT, taking the MCAT? Are there some classes that you suggest they can also take prior to taking the MCAT?
That's a really good question. And I remember trying to find data to support the timeline. And it really just kind of depends on your life circumstances and also what classes you took in undergrad. When I was studying for the MCAT, I had just finished my undergraduate degree, so things were still pretty fresh. And what I ended up doing was utilizing like the AAMC. That's like where you apply for medical school. They have like assessments that you can buy. I highly recommend doing like a diagnostic exam before you start studying for the MCAT, just to give you a baseline of where are you at. And then I recommended the question bank called UWorld. One of the big reasons, I wish I would have done this, I just didn't know it existed, is that they'll give you lots of questions and then they'll have amazing explanations at the end to kind of help teach you the material through active learning. I initially studied, I believe it was about 3 months, and then ended up delaying it. I was in the boat of I was working 2 jobs, one full-time, one part-time, and volunteering, and I realized I just could not get through all the material in that 3 months. So I ended up extending my time for the MCAT. I know people that have done it in a month. It really just depends on where you're at. I wish I had a more concrete answer, but I really think starting off with the diagnostic exam and utilizing active learning resources will help guide you as to where you're at and the score you want to achieve.
Thank you. And so another question from the comments is, what are some things that really stand out in the CV?
Things that you're passionate about. So, things like research can obviously stand out, doing work in the medical field. Those are all things that show that you have experience. But at the end of the day in the interview, they're going to ask you about things. And just to be clear, everything that you put on your application is fair game. So I remember I put on my application, one of my leadership experiences was I started a composting program in my undergraduate. Not related to medicine, but I am passionate about it. And they asked me about it and just my eyes lit up because I was like, oh my gosh, I just want to talk about this all day. And that was something that I remember them saying like, wow, we just hadn't seen someone, have like an environmental related, endeavor in a, really long time. It wasn't something that they really expressed. So when it comes to your CV, things like research and medical things are always helpful. But don't limit yourself. If you did a leadership project that wasn't related to medicine, but you're passionate about it, or you put in the work, include that. So really thinking about leadership opportunities, even if it was something like mentorship, you can be mentoring high school students. There's so many things that you can be doing that can really help you stand out. But again, just don't limit yourself and saying, I have to be an EMT and I have to do X, Y, and Z.
Mm-hmm. And so another question is that, how about study abroad? Is study abroad something that, like, does it provide experiences prior to applying to medical school?
I never personally studied abroad, and my reasoning was I've always been very distrustful of, I don't know if you guys have heard of kind of like the white savior complex, which is kind of this dangerous public health territory of you go into an area and then for 2 weeks you take all the cute photos and then you're like, yay, I helped. But in reality, you didn't actually really help and you actually were contributing to a bigger problem. Highly recommend you guys go read up on public health measures if you're not too sure what I'm talking about. That's not to say studying abroad is a bad thing, but I think it's something you shouldn't do and be like, I'm going to go pay $2,000 to go to, Nicaragua and help for 2 weeks, unless it's a really good organization and you have obviously the finances to do it. I think what's you're better off doing is doing something that you're passionate about and not feeling like you have to do study abroad. I remember feeling that, but my gut was, I couldn't find an organization that I was really passionate about. Having said that, there are wonderful organizations. One is called Do Care. I haven't studied abroad with them, but I've had classmates that have. The Student National Medical Association, they also do global health trips. So there are amazing opportunities, but especially if finances are tight, I don't recommend spending $2,000 or whatever to do a 2-week trip just to have it on your CV.
Okay. And so another question is how do you suggest students conquer, like pre-med students conquer the feeling of imposter syndrome as they go on their path toward medical school?
Oh, I wish I had an easy answer for that. That's something I'm still trying to figure out as it is. Big thing is, I think, reaching out to people who are like a year older than you or people who have already been through the process. That can be really, really helpful to just kind of help you combat your nervousness. I mean, before I started my second year of medical school, I ended up reaching out to a third year, just like, I am so afraid. How am I going to do on my boards? And it was so validating to hear how she was like, oh my gosh, I experienced the exact same things as you, and here's resources I use. And even something that I experience all the time in clinic is they tell you like the camera's always on, where basically like every person you interact with, from the janitors to the physicians, everyone's watching you. And it can leave you with this feeling of like, oh my gosh, am I doing things right? All eyes are on you. And one of the things that my preceptor actually informed me of is he was like, you're one of the few med students I've met that you knew the janitor's name was Kathy. And like, I never said hi to her when my preceptor was around. I just was like, oh, I'm just going to get to know her. Like, I'm seeing her all the time. And that was something that stood out to him. And he's like, and I really want to write you a letter of recommendation, because that's not something, because a lot of med students are like, okay, well, I'm on game when I'm around the doctor or I'm around the nurses. And so I think it's just really important to know that if you're doing this, you're doing it from the heart. That sounds so cheesy, but like, keep reflecting on like, why are you doing this, and connecting with people and knowing that there are resources. So signing up for mentorship programs is so helpful. Even to this day, like, I'm connected with, I'm really interested in surgery. So I'm connected with some female surgeons that are help guiding me. And when I have those moments of like, oh my gosh, am I doing okay? It's really helpful to have that reassurance.
Okay. So like as a pre-med student, like what skills have you learned, I guess, to help you manage your time and relieve stress?
Big thing for me is I do meditation or yoga almost every day. I know that's not necessarily for everyone, but I don't think I would be doing as well as I am in medical school if I didn't utilize those things. For me, incorporating physical exercise almost every day is immensely helpful, especially when you're studying for like your second year boards. We do a period called dedicated, which is essentially where all your school classes are done and you're literally just studying for boards. So I spent at least a month straight, 7 days a week, of studying almost 12 hours a day, and it was exhausting, but I still made sure to make time for myself. So with that, putting that aside about trying to take care of your well-being, it's also being really smart about your resources. So when you're pre-med or in medical school, there are literally thousands, if not millions, of resources that you can do to learn the exact same information. And so part of the process of being a medical student is really working your way down to consolidate about what you're going to use. So I always use the key resources that basically have been time and tested that other medical students have used. And with that, I also was really smart about how I scheduled things. So for example, there's a resource called Cram Fighter. And Cram Fighter is designed for like when you're in medical school, you can basically put in like when you have your school exams and what resources you want to use, and it will calculate like how many practice questions to do a day, etc. And I loved that because it made it very interactive, where I could move things around, and it took a lot of the thinking out. Because one of the hardest things about med school is you literally could always be studying. There's always more to learn. So it's about sort of prioritizing your time and not spending all day writing things out. So in undergrad, I used to write everything out in my planner. Med school, there was just way too much to do, and it was too overwhelming and inefficient. So I really started to utilize the online model. I utilize Google Calendar to schedule, even things like exercise. My family, they make fun of me because I'll schedule like hangouts with my family with Google Calendar. You don't have to be that excessive, but for me, it's helpful because I always am able to manage my time and see the big picture before a week.
That sounds wonderful. It takes a lot of time to like manage and schedule, because sometimes schedules, they just like some things happen that you can't just control and just ruin schedules, I guess.
Yeah, and
But
being flexible is super important. Take it day by day. My goal is always like on Sunday night, I have like my goals for the week and I have it mapped out. Very rarely, if ever, is stay exactly the same. So just allowing yourself to be flexible and adaptable. And I think that's really the biggest, well, there's many keys to success in med school, but that's one of the biggest ones is being adaptable, being used to if a patient's going to be grumpy, being used to having 3 big exams in a week. Just today I had an exam that was worth 60% of my grade. And just trying to get used to that stress and managing day by day, like making sure that you set yourself up for success.
that's true. Like as a pre-med student myself, I try to make a general schedule that I work with. However, every night before, I also make a daily schedule so I can be sure of what I'm doing. Okay, Esther says, like, what classes do we have to go to med school? For the class requirements, yeah, I guess.
Yeah, so that will depend on the school. Most schools, they'll require, I believe, like organic chemistry, sometimes biochemistry. Most require 2 semesters of physics. I quite frankly don't really remember the details. I recommend going to the admissions websites for schools. Most of them have like the same structure, but the ones I highly recommend, even if it's not required, is if you can take microbiology, anatomy and physiology, and then biochemistry. A resource I want to throw out there that's amazing that like every medical student uses for microbiology is called Sketchy Micro. It is absolutely amazing. Basically, to learn microbiology, you get like these stories and visuals. And so it allows you to memorize bugs based on like color schemes. And I scored really, really high on my boards. And thankfully, microbiology, I scored in like one of the top tiers, and I attributed it to Sketchy Micro. And all these products that I'm endorsing, I'm speaking truly from personal experience. I'm not compensated at all. So I want to just reiterate that.
And also, like, when should you suggest it's best to apply to medical school? Which year in your undergraduates?
So that I don't have a good answer for because I applied after graduating from undergrad. I have friends that apply. They started their application, I believe, their junior year of undergrad, and then we're doing interviews their senior year. And for some people that works great. My bias is I highly recommend taking at least 1 gap year and, maybe starting your application your senior year and then applying during a gap year. But that's just my bias. I think maybe talk to a pre-med advisor if you want to do an undergraduate route, just because I didn't do that, so I don't have a lot of good information.
Okay, that sounds great. And so knowing that you're doing clinical rotations right now, what kind of experience have you had working with patients? And have those skills taught you anything that you didn't know beforehand?
Oh my gosh, I could literally talk for days on end about the amazing experiences about clinical rotations. But I'll try to keep it short. So one of the big things is patients don't read the med school textbooks. There are a lot of like clinical scenarios where you learn it, and for your exams in school and for your board exams, it's like, okay, if you see X, Y, and Z, it's this disease. Or as soon as you see that buzzword, you're like, okay, it's this disease. But then in clinical practice, it's oftentimes a very different story. And so that's been one of the most illuminating things for me is seeing the diversity of how something like pancreatitis can present. Or like the other day, there was a patient with what we thought was clear-cut case of appendicitis, but it actually wasn't appendicitis. And it was like, but according to the textbook, it should have been appendicitis. And then the other really big thing that I have taken away is the importance of what we call social determinants of health. So we all know that our health is so much more than just our physical body. It's our ability to eat healthy. Can we afford to go to a doctor's appointment? I remember I was talking with a family recently. It was a pediatric well-child visit. And one of the things that you learn in medical school is you ask like, oh, does the kid, sit in a car seat up to the age of 2 when they're in the car? And I asked the question and the mom looked at me confused and she was like, oh, we don't have a car. And it was just like a really powerful moment of remembering that like we learn things in a certain way, but oftentimes people, their life experiences are very different. And so thinking about like they couldn't afford a car. You know, for me, I was working at a community health center called Health Point, which is near Seattle and Washington. And we worked with a lot of refugees. And so I rarely had a patient that I wasn't using a translator for. And so it was really impactful for me to learn through some of those language barriers, thinking about things like health literacy. And again, I can talk all day about this, but I really hope the takeaway is you have to learn diagnoses for your test, but don't forget about treating the whole person, thinking about how you can diagnose diabetes, but can someone afford insulin? Does someone know how to use insulin? We had a patient who she didn't know how to use her insulin injection. So she was getting the prescription, but her test result that we call a hemoglobin A1C that looks at the blood sugar levels, it was kept going up and we were confused. And it turns out she had a language barrier and didn't understand how to actually inject the insulin. So thinking about the whole person is so important, and financial barriers, especially in the time of COVID. Again, I can talk all day about it, but hopefully it's a general summary.
Thank you very much. And so Skylar's asking, what is pros and cons to taking a gap year?
Big pro is you get the opportunity to really see, is this exactly what you want to do, and to get more experience. You can build a lot more, I think, like just personal growth and maturity. For me, I had no business experience in my undergraduate program. And then during my gap year, I ended up working at leading this department where I learned like what a profit margin was. And I was managing the accounting, and it not only helped me stand out on my application of like, hey, this is something unique that other med students likely haven't done, but it also gave me a bigger context of like, I don't want just this 9-to-5 job. It gave me even more motivation as to like why I want to go to med school. Big downside is you're away from the social support of like your undergraduate program. Like you're away from pre-med club, you're away from advisors. So I remember feeling very isolated and feeling just like, oh my gosh, like I'm by myself applying to med school. Like I have my family, but there's no one sort of like keeping me on track. And so for anyone that knows for sure they want to do medicine, like maybe it's a great option just to go straight in. But I can tell you the burnout in med school is immense. The amount of depression is immense. I've known students who unfortunately have taken their lives while in medical school, and physicians that have taken their lives. And it's not something to brush over. It's a systemic problem that's not based on individual weakness. And so I think with taking something like a gap year that provides you the opportunity to really figure out, is this something you really want to do, to start building networking. Another big pro I want to mention is shadowing different providers. So oftentimes you come into medical school and they're already like, well, are you going to do primary care? Are you going to do surgery? Are you going to do this? And first off, it's okay that you don't know, but I wish I would have explored more specialty options before I started med school, because now that I'm in my third year, I finished 4 weeks of family med, and then I just finished 4 weeks of inpatient family medicine, and then I'm doing general surgery next. And I basically have, I think it's 8 weeks of electives of where I can explore the specialties, but that's really it. And it's otherwise like, then I'm in my 4th year and I got to figure out where I'm applying to residency. So if you take a gap year, I think it's really wonderful if you can utilize different opportunities to shadow as many different specialties as possible. You may be surprised at what you connect with.
That sounds wonderful. Okay, for the last few minutes, Esther would like to know, do med schools take research or work experience into consideration when looking at applications?
Absolutely, absolutely. And in fact, this is where I was talking about with my application. I was told that the fact that I had experience outside of just being a scribe or just doing lab work in undergraduate, in my undergraduate program, the fact that I'd worked in a business capacity, the fact that I'd led a department stood out. And so that's where not just having good grades can really help you stand out. So if you are especially someone that maybe hasn't had the best grades, or you had just like a few moments where things didn't quite go to plan, this is your opportunity to show like, okay, well, in person, I'm a hard worker and here's all the evidence to show it. I am resilient, and really like, don't just do, oh, that's the other thing. Don't just do research for the sake of research. I have been told this from mentors all over the place, because I've never, like for me, I've never been published before, and it's always been one of my biggest insecurities. And even though I've like done research but never been published, and I always get told from like residency program directors is they can tell when someone does research just for the sake of it, as opposed to someone who is so passionate about it. And so if you're going to do research or a job, like really think about what you're trying to get out of the experience, as opposed to viewing it like a checklist of like, I need to do this, this, and this, and then I'm going to get into med school. I have classmates that were one of my good friends. She was a public school teacher for many years and then decided she wanted to be a physician. And, then she went back to finish up her prereqs and all of those things for it. But it's those kinds of stories that I hopefully inspire hope that regardless of where you're at, you have the potential to become a physician. It's not going to be easy. And just please, again, I can't say it enough, don't limit yourself or think that this is the one path that you have to take.
I apologize. Thank you very much, Renee. We have one last question I'd like to ask. And so, why did you choose medicine and not some other field where you can still help others, such as pharmacology, maybe education or social work?
That's a really good question. The big thing is because medicine involves social work, pharmacology, teaching, all of those things in one. One of the biggest reasons why I realized I wanted to do medicine as opposed to being a teacher is because as a future physician, I will be a primary educator. I can already tell you as a medical student, I'm counseling patients on diabetes. I'm talking to them about managing incision and drainage. And so I really like that aspect. I like the idea, or not even the idea because I'm doing it, but being able to tangibly help individuals. And also medicine's a very unique field where people open up at some of their most vulnerable times. And I just feel that immense privilege in being able to do that. I think you can get that with social work or being a pharmacist and being a teacher, but with medicine, you're really directly impacting lives and you get to do so much with it. I'm very much a hands-on person and I just love working with people, and this seemed like a great avenue to be able to be a teacher and be able to help change people's lives, not just for their physical health, but for their emotional well-being. If I can just share one quick story, there was a patient the other week. She was an older refugee from Afghanistan, and she had horrible PTSD. She saw like 5 family members die. And I remember walking into the room and hearing this story and just feeling so overwhelmed, like, what am I, a third-year medical student, going to be able to do for this patient? And really all I did was I listened. I counseled with my attending physician about possibly some medications that we might be able to adjust for her GERD and for her hypertension. But at the end of the day, she came back once a week for the rest of my family medicine rotation because she just wanted to see me. And I was kind of bewildered because it was like, why? I'm not doing anything, but it's the power of, she just felt like someone was listening. And it's very rare to find a career or an avenue where people are able to be that open, to be able to trust you, and for you just to have that privilege of getting to see the inner workings of someone. So I just feel very fortunate. It's a long road for those of you out there. If you're feeling discouraged, please don't give up on yourself. Even to this day, like as a med student, I still struggle with imposter syndrome where I am just like, oh my gosh, how am I doing so good? And it just feels like, okay, someone's going to pull the rug from under me. And it's that constant reminder of like, why are you doing this in the first place? And knowing that you're giving it your all. You're going to make mistakes, but if you can be genuine to yourself and try to basically put the ladder down so you can help other people back up in the process, things are going to work out.
That sounds great. Thank you very much, Janae. Thank you everyone else for joining our session today. We'll be having other future medical events, so make sure to subscribe and click the notification bell to keep updated. And also make sure to follow our social media platforms on Instagram, LinkedIn, and Facebook to keep updated. Thank you very much, Janae, for being with us today and giving us the opportunity to know a little bit more about the path we're hoping to pursue one day. Thank you very much.
Thank you guys so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Oh.